Hey everyone, Robert Murphy and with Jordan Johnson again. We help lead the online campus, and we're going through Matthew's book for the first part of 2014. And one of the things we're doing is, as we go through it, is we have this guide here we're calling the Field Guide, and we've been doing some sessions here online. And today we're on session 4, which is on page 78 of your Field Guide, if you have it. Now we're not going to go through all the questions, but we're just going to talk about a few of the things as they relate to the passage that we're covering today, and that's from Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 through 20. As you know, it's part of the Sermon on the Mount. So since it's pretty short, I'm just going to read it really quickly. So Matthew 5, starting with verse 17, Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, this is we've talked a little bit about Jesus coming to flip the script a little bit, but here he gives honor and just making sure we kind of, word comes to mind is respect the law. And Jordan, I know when we talked a little bit ahead of time, just we kind of honed in on the third and fourth question there on the page. And one of the things people are very aware of in this world is legalism. I think people have an understanding that laws are there for a reason, but then they can be taken to an extreme. So I mean, just when you think of when people take that perspective of legalism, I mean, what are you thinking? Like, what are your thoughts on just that in general, just that perspective that sometimes people have when it comes to the law?
Yeah, well, I think just reading through both these questions, and we'll get to the next question here coming up, but it's the balance of grace and truth in what Jesus is doing. And we are called to live under the law and live under the 10 Commandments, that the law that's been set from very early on, for Israel and through everything that they went through. And I just think that the thing is, when you focus so much on the laws, then when it comes really damaging is when you fail. And so once you fail and you've let down one part of that legalism, there's not, if you're just looking at it in a legalistic way, I feel like there's not much grace there. And so it's really just painful and hurtful and damaging to the person who's kind of is underneath that view, because they're so focused on only upholding these laws, only focusing on those things, that everything's going well as long as they're meeting that, and they're upholding all those laws. But then when they stumble, what do they do then?
Yeah, I think that's really good. I think another thing I think of when it comes to this, and you said it eloquently, but I think a lot of times people who are legalistic, this isn't across the board, but I think often it's a form of control. It's something they're very good in, and it's usually people who we consider legalists. What they get hung up on are issues that maybe a majority of Christians or majority of people don't struggle with. I always think of like when it comes to morality issues, and it's easy to get hammer people on that because I'm more moral, but we don't usually hammer people on whether it's gossip or just loving your neighbor, because that's something we all need to improve on. It always seems to be issues that, like, are we really focusing in on this secondary issue? We're missing like the bigger picture, and like the law is a good thing. I think it's there to help us. I heard someone say once, it's parameters for us to operate in, and I think that's a good way of putting it. But when we just focus in so much on that, like you said, we lose sight of Jesus. We lose sight of love. Like it said in the New Testament, Jesus, being with the Spirit, he's full of truth, but also grace. He said full of grace and truth, and you need both to kind of balance out the other. And so it's important to have that. And that kind of leads into the next question about the other extreme with legalism is that there's this grace and grace upon grace, and you need to give me grace. And so just on that aspect, Jordan, I mean, like, when you hear that, when you hear someone like say, who's, and I've heard this more often than not from people who love Jesus and follow Jesus, they're like, well, you just need to give me grace. You need to give me grace. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that that Jesus, obviously in this passage, is affirming those laws. He's affirming those things. So it's saying like, yeah, we need to give grace to people because we all sin. We're all sinners. None of us are going to go through life without needing grace. But it's just this idea that keep giving me grace, keep giving me grace. Well, what effort are you putting in, to follow these things Jesus has said?
Yeah.
What are you just taking grace so you don't want to deal with the truth, of the law and, the other things Jesus said, that he's saying like, yeah, these are parameters. Like, this is how I want you to operate. And, if you're putting in your effort to stay within those and to live life to the fullest, based off of the guidelines Jesus gave us, then yeah, you might stumble and you deserve that grace.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of, even with Jesus, like he gives us grace we don't deserve.
Yeah.
And gives grace to everyone equally.
Yeah.
But to really just, be in a healthy relationship with Jesus and be healthy, spiritually, you have to be putting in the effort to follow those things that Jesus affirmed. Right here he's saying like, I support these laws, like, and he's going to change things because he is the new covenant. So some things are going to change, but like, those commandments, those will always be there.
Yeah.
And if you're not, striving to follow Jesus with those in mind, then you're really, you're kind of picking and choosing.
Yeah.
And that's where you get in a lot of trouble. You have to do both. You have to follow these laws. You have to accept grace and you have to give grace.
Yeah.
So it's not an easy thing.
Yeah.
And it's something that you're going to keep going through, in your whole life.
Yeah, and I think that's well said. I think it's not a license to sin. It's something I think of. God is gracious. God does forgive, and he has forgiven us. But that doesn't mean we continue to stay in the life that we are. We continue to stay in sin because, Jesus desires us to be better and to experience life the way he intended. And if we continue to sin, then we're not doing that. We're not truly pursuing Jesus. And some Romans 6 and Romans 5 through 7, but Romans 6 is something that really expands on this well. So I'd encourage you to check that out. But from the Gospels, I think of John chapter 8, the woman caught in adultery, which is a good example of kind of grace and truth, where there was the law of someone who's caught in adultery. Now, always the interesting matter is where was the dude that was obviously caught in adultery? The Pharisees didn't want to deal with that, and I had a teacher who once said it was probably one of the Pharisees. It's conjecture, but they're going to do their part to set up the situation for Jesus per se. But so they bring the woman caught in adultery. She was in sin, and then Jesus kind of asks the question. He who was out sin can cast the first stone. So then they all leave, which is interesting. It goes back to they had no consideration for her, no wanting the best for her. They just wanted to condemn her, which goes back to the whole legalism thing. And here it's like, oh, Jesus is giving grace. But I always kind of hit on this with the last line he says. He says, is anyone here to condemn you? And she's like, no. Then he says, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. And I think that's the thing with grace is it's there. It does forgive us. It's there to pick us up when we fall down, but it's to help us move forward toward Jesus.
Yeah, I actually just finished reading Brennan Manning's memoir called All Is Grace, and just something that came out of there and conversation I had about the book is that he really sees grace as not an excuse to keep sinning,
right,
but a reason to try again.
Yeah,
and it's this it's this idea of moving forward, knowing that you're not condemned by your failure, but that you do want to try to move forward and to move past that.
Yeah. Now, this is stuff that people have been wrestling with for centuries, but it's good stuff. It's sometimes people will say, "Hey, I don't read the Old Testament. I just deal with the New Testament." I think that's a faulty belief, and some people just harp in on the Old Testament and hey, that's good stuff as well. But hey, Jesus came with the new covenant, and he came to, like you said, he came to fulfill the law, and so the law wasn't bad. He came to fulfill it. He saw it as good, and so there's stuff there for both of us. So I'd encourage you to, if you have these questions, let us know, or keep digging into your Bible, keep reading it, and see how the Old and New Testament kind of work together. And grace and truth, it's there for our benefit and for the benefit of everyone else. But on behalf of Jordan, I'm Robert. Hey, thanks everyone for watching, and we'll talk to you soon.